Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenniger, and welcome to the Eddy Network podcast. My guest today is Jeff Krehmer. He is a energy engineer. Is that a good way to say it? Energy
mechanical engineer, yes.
Mechanical engineer who works in the energy sector, and I think this is going to be very interesting. And thank you for coming, Jeff. And look forward to having this conversation with you. Tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are and where you live and anything that you think is worth sharing.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm a professional mechanical engineer in the province of Alberta, Canada. I live about halfway between the two largest cities in Alberta, which is just north of Red Deer. And I've been working in the oil and gas industry for most of my professional career. But I just finished writing a book, as you can see here behind me, Infinite Resources. And that is all about transitioning away from oil and gas to renewable energy sources, and something that hasn't been looked at previously. So that book, the subtitle of it is How to Sustainably Develop the Arctic by Supplying Green Hydrogen, Fresh Water, and Healthy Food to the World while Mitigating the Negative Effects of Anthropogenic Climate Change. So a lot of people, if you think about the Arctic, all you can imagine, all most people would think about, I imagine, is a frozen wasteland. We don't have any trees. You imagine snow blowing around, and the Arctic Ocean and the area around Antarctica is extremely cold. And the coldest temperatures measured in the world were in Antarctica. On the surface, it was like minus 89 degrees Celsius, which, even if you're looking at Fahrenheit, that's extremely cold. What we don't realize is that around the oceans, of course, ice floats, and we've got this wonderful insulating layer between the cold atmosphere and the ocean below. And if you go under the water at any time of year in the Arctic or Antarctic oceans, you will find abundant life. And of course, in the summertime, when the sun is shining through the ice, the algae starts to grow, and that you get mats of algae growing on the bottom of the ice, and that feeds copepods, and then the fish come along and eat the copepods, and there's an entire food chain there. In the wintertime in the Arctic, that's fairly dormant. But the thing to know is that the animals are living in the same temperature essentially year round. As long as there's ice in the water, that water temperature is going to stay at that minus 1.8 degrees Celsius. And anyway, from an engineering perspective, anytime you have a large temperature difference, so like I said, minus 1.8 degrees Celsius for the water is the temperature at which seawater freezes. And the atmosphere, let's say it was minus 40 or minus 42. I'll say minus 42 because that's where the Celsius and Fahrenheit scales meet. You can run a vapor power cycle to tap into the energy that's available there. And if you're familiar with a propane stove, then you have a bottle that's under pressure, and the pressure inside is dependent on the temperature outside.
Mm-hmm.
So as the propane heats, the pressure, as long as it's contained, will increase. So again, that minus 42 just happens to be the temperature at which propane is about 1 atmosphere of pressure that it has inside the bottle. Anything above that, you'll be able to force the gas out into atmospheric pressure and use it in a barbecue or whatever application you're using. So at about the freezing point of fresh water, the propane has a pressure of about 4.5 atmospheres. And if you increase that pressure, you get close to the critical point of propane, which is 96.7 degrees Celsius. And at that pressure, you're close to 42 atmospheres, or at that temperature. So there is energy available for you to run a power cycle. And the thing to know about this is the only limitations that you have on that power cycle are the size of your heat exchangers in the ocean, the size of the heat exchanger in the atmosphere, and the amount, like the size of the equipment that you have to extract the energy. So this is where I get the infinite resources from. You know, I figured that I did some calculations in the book, and if we had built 1 gigawatt plants of able to produce one gigawatt of power, let's say at that temperature differential that I was discussing, minus 40 degrees Celsius in the atmosphere, and you started making concentric rings like in a hexagonal form. So you'd start out with one plant in the center, and then you'd have another ring. Each of these power plants producing a gigawatt. So the first ring you would have 7, including the one in the center, and the next one you would have 13, including the ones inside. If you do 18 rings like that, you would have over 1,000 1 gigawatt plants in a relatively small area, and you don't have to worry about the heat being lost or anything, because what you're doing is you're siphoning water up from the deep ocean, which is always at around 4 degrees Celsius, and that's true in the tropics, and that's true in the polar regions. And you're siphoning that water up from the deep, using it to boil your propane, and then running it through this power process and condensing it in the atmosphere, pumping it down at pressure again below the ice to repeat the cycle. And the only exhaust that you get from this is freshwater ice, because when you freeze salt water, only the water freezes, and the salt, if you think of those water molecules coming together, they want to form a crystal, and they exclude the sodium and the chlorine and the other elements in there. And when you melt that ice, you end up getting potable water. So that's part of the title that I had there.
So in capturing the energy from this, is the terminology vapor exchange?
I call them polar energy platforms,
Okay.
so PEP for short.
So capturing that energy in the Arctic, and probably could do that in the Antarctic as well.
Yeah.
How then does that energy get transferred to population centers?
Right. So basically what you're doing is you're going to convert that energy into electricity. So the best use of that electricity would be to use it on site for whatever. So I talk about using it, for instance, to run data centers. But once you've saturated a specific market, then you can use that electricity to produce hydrogen. And hydrogen is notoriously difficult to transport, so you can convert that hydrogen with atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into ammonia. And then once you got it as ammonia, you can use that directly as a fuel. There's a lot of research into using ammonia as a substitute for diesel fuel. And interestingly enough, if you when Neil Armstrong was a test pilot in the X-15s, those X-15s were run on ammonia rocket engines.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah. And so the world record, speed record, at least the official speed record, is for an ammonia rocket engine. And then that ammonia, of course, is also a precursor for making fertilizers and explosives as well. So the AMPHO that they use for mining, for instance, is derived from ammonia, and ammonia.
So this is a new scientific advancement, let's say, which provides a new way of looking at how we're going to generate the energy that we need to run society in the future. And how does this compare, say, in the cost of developing this to like all the money that's gone into wind farms, into solar panels and things like that? How do these different versions of these new kind of energy capturing devices, how do they
Right. So let's take a look at wind farms, and this is a very apropos to what I'm talking about. So if you think about a wind turbine, some of the largest ones now, the swept area that those propellers are taking in, it's like the size of 3 football fields, like unimaginably big. And if you think about the energy that they're operating off of, if you put a barometer in front of a wind turbine and put a barometer behind the wind turbine, essentially you're going to be measuring the same atmospheric pressure, right?
Right.
So the difference that you're tapping into is the wind speed, and literally the wind speed is slightly faster in front of the wind turbine. Then you absorb some energy, and it's slightly slower after the wind turbine. That's a very, very small amount of pressure difference to be working with to generate. The largest land-based wind turbines, I think, are in the range of about 9.5 megawatts, and that's made by Vestas Corporation. They have a 9.5 megawatt version, and there is new technology that's coming out to make contra-rotating turbines. There's a Norwegian company, and they're setting up a 30 kilowatt plant as a prototype. And if that works, they think they can scale it up to 40 megawatts. So if you think of that, what's involved with that, you'd have a platform in the ocean, and you're producing 40 megawatts. And you compare that to, say, a coal burning plant, which can be up to a gigawatt or more. So in terms of order of magnitude, let's say that 40 megawatts, you're looking at like 25 times the capacity of energy production from that coal fired plant, as opposed to, so you'd have to have like 25 of these 40 megawatt plants to produce the same amount of energy. That's a fairly substantial input of resources to make that. Now, I'm all in favor of renewable resources, and I think this is the future. Obviously, what I'm talking about is renewable too. But in the same footprint of that one floating wind turbine, we could build one of these polar energy platforms, have our heat exchangers going deep into the ocean, and produce that 1 gigawatt that I'm talking about. And if you want to expand it, you could build an identical plant right beside it and be able to tap into it. So you could literally have, like, a kilometer, so that's like, half a mile of these plants side by side, sucking energy out of the deep ocean, releasing it to the atmosphere, and producing potable water as a byproduct.
So um I'm a real novice at this. A novice may be overstating it. Um, so what at what level of water temperature can you do you expect to need in order to establish one of these plants where that process can be? So what is that? I mean, I'm thinking is, if you can do that in the Arctic, can you do that, say, in colder climes like off like in the North Sea, or in the North Atlantic, things like that? Is it?
Yeah, so what makes the system work isn't the temperature of the water, because the salt water is going to freeze at about the same temperature anywhere in the world. What makes it work is the cold in the atmosphere.
Oh,
So if you have a warm temperature in the North Sea, or someplace else, you can't get the energy out of it in the way that I was describing.
uh,
Uh, there is a system out there called OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, and the concept has been around since before the 1920s, and there have been several attempts to commercialize it. And the idea there is to use warm surface temperature water in the tropics, so at about, say, 27 degrees, and run a similar vapor cycle like I'm talking about. But then you're working with 27 degrees as your high end temperature, 4 degrees as your low end temperature, and I'm talking in Celsius here. And so that only gives you 23 degrees difference, and you have to deal with heat exchangers, and because the cold water is denser, you have to expend energy to pump it up from the deep ocean. um, and so they've never had a really successful commercial operation doing it. The University of Hawaii has done some interesting research, and they found that, bringing up cold ocean water was good for their agricultural program, because then the atmospheric water will condense on those pipes, and it'll cool the soil, and the plants like to have cooler soil, and so they grow better in those conditions. But like I said, commercially, they haven't been able to extract a lot of energy from it at this point.
How did you come to see this? What was that process that you went through where you began to identify the factors that go into this methodology?
Yeah, so like I said, we were talking a bit earlier. I'm a bit of an omnivore when it comes to knowledge, and I'm interested in all sorts of different fields. But like I said, this isn't new technology. National Geographic had an article in the mid-70s about ocean thermal energy conversion. And so, Popular Mechanics, I think, has had stuff that they've written about it as well. And you can do a search on the internet. There's a country called, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Noaru. And the Japanese company Hitachi tried to set up an OTEC system for them to generate power. And there's other benefits that come along with that OTEC. So one of them, if you're using a low water vapor cycle, you can actually distill fresh water out of the ocean, because of course you're using the water vapor. It doesn't have any salt in it, and it's just like the natural water cycle essentially. But because it's working at low vapor pressure, you'd have to have a lot, like a large turbine to be able to capture the energy. And again, when you're pumping water up from the deep ocean, that takes energy. Now the difference, and I want to point this out just so we're clear, what I'm proposing is kind of the opposite. So if we have a siphon, if you imagine it starting at about, I don't know, 150, 350 meters below the ocean surface, and it comes up, and then we extract the heat from that water, what you're going to be left with is, of course, the ice is going to float out of that, and you'll be left with a salty brine that is at a denser temperature. And if you have a funnel leading down into the ocean deeper than that 150 meters that you're sucking it up from, that means that you're essentially getting free pumping, so that we don't have to worry about the pumping losses in that situation.
Right.
So if you think of the fresh water as being a side effect, or basically the exhaust of our system, if we can sell it in the form of bottled water and distribute it around the world. I even was talking about how we could potentially sell bottled water to wealthy nations, and then give as a donation an equivalent amount of water to nations where they don't have access to fresh water. That would be like a humanitarian aid program, and you could generate enough money. I do some interesting calculations in there. So in the book, I don't have the hard numbers on what it would cost to build one of these energy platforms. So I said, let's take the worst case scenario. Let's say it's going to cost 1.5 times as much as the most expensive oil drilling platform to build one of these. So the most expensive oil drilling platform is controlled by Russia in the Sea of Okhotsk. It's designed to withstand Arctic ice conditions, and it costs about $12 billion US to build that.
Wow.
Yeah, and so let's say that we take that $12 billion. We're going to be working in even more extreme conditions. Let's add an extra 50%. So that gives us $18 billion. And for the sake of argument, we'll make the prototype. We'll give it a contingency of an extra $2 billion for a nice round $20 billion. So I did some calculations. If we can sell bottled water, so retail costs would be like 25 cents for half a liter. I'm not sure what that works out to in US parlance, but anyways.
Me neither.
So 25 cents, this half a liter is, I think pop cans are 333 milliliters, and that's,
Yeah.
anyways. So it's a little bit more than that. For 25 cents, and half of that money, or let's say 12 cents, goes to the retailer, 1 cent is for the bottle. That leaves 12.5 cents to cover your operations. Well, we'd be literally able to sell billions of these bottles, and we could finance the money, that $20 billion, we could make it back in water sales and still be supplying water to people in need. So in terms of economic performance, just that one aspect of building one of these polar energy platforms, you'd have a return on your investment of about 1 year just from the water sales, not including the electricity production, hydrogen sales, or ammonia sales. And there's other things that I talk about in there that are also counterintuitive. So like I said in the subtitle, it's supplying green hydrogen, fresh water, and healthy food to the world. So think about this. A greenhouse, what's required to operate a greenhouse? You need to have a temperature that's above freezing. You need to have water. You need to have light. And you need to have some sort of fertilizer and a medium to grow in. Well, think of the Arctic polar ice cap. You have got right below you that huge heat reservoir that I was just talking about. It's an easy thing to increase the temperature from a couple of degrees below freezing to say 15 degrees Celsius, or even, let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a nice comfortable temperature to grow the plants in. So that's easy to do. You just need electricity to run the heat pump. Then the fertilizer, well, I was talking about producing ammonia. That's a great fertilizer, but so let's say you import the fertilizer, whatever, if you don't produce it on site. And then the light, well, of course, in the Arctic, in the middle of winter, there's basically no natural sunlight. So, but you've got electricity, and we've got very efficient LEDs now, so we can light that artificially. Then you have to worry about keeping the energy inside. So you build this in a shipping container, you have good insulation around it, and you can grow anything. And we know from the illegal growing operations for marijuana and stuff that this stuff is all very doable. So for the initial investment of the container, I have a little chapter, I call it, or a portion of a chapter. It's called Little Greenhouse on the Polar Ice Cap. And it talks about how we can grow essentially what we want in those conditions. Because let's take a look at California. You're growing avocados in the desert essentially. Well, if California continues to experience a drought, it might make more sense to grow your avocados on the polar ice cap.
So let me all these questions come to mind. So is the technology, every question leads to another question. Does this end up promoting the settlement of the far north? And does that look like the possibility where you have a home and you have your own pocket little energy producer?
Yeah.
And it's at that level of I don't know the right word, miniaturization or something like it. It can function at that level, I guess.
Yes. So everything that I'm talking about is scalable. So if you think of that propane bottle that's operating your barbecue, you could. I'm actually thinking of trying to set up a business. I've got, as you can tell, I've got lots of business ideas, and really the
Sure.
reason for writing this this book, like I mentioned to you earlier, is that I had a heart attack a few years ago. I didn't want these ideas to die with me, but really what I want to do is set up a whole family of companies based on this and other technologies that I'm developing, and I'm looking for investors to get that off the ground. But here's an idea. Have you ever gone ice fishing?
I have never gone ice fishing.
Okay, well, it's
I've seen
pretty
it.
popular in Minnesota
Yeah.
and in Canada here. So imagine you're out on a lake, and in Minnesota, people like to take these sheds out on the lake, and they'll, you know, they. So let's imagine that you have an inflatable tent, and built into that tent, you've got a heat exchanger and some other equipment. You can drop one of these propane tanks down into the water, boil it off, run it through a little turbine, generate enough electricity to keep your space warm inside of that tent, and probably have enough to charge your cell phone and watch the football game or something like that if you have satellite technology there.
It's like a self-charging battery.
Yeah, and so and the colder it is, the better it works. So yeah, that's a good thing for as opposed to burning fossil fuels. You have to put more fuel in to keep yourself warm. In this case, you would be extracting more energy out of the lake, but because the outside air temperature is colder, you have a bigger pressure differential, so you can actually generate more power.
So, so I'm looking at the feasibility of doing this on at scale. And so you've got this, you've got wind, you got solar, and you got petroleum,
Hmm.
oil, and they're all competing for basically government investment
Yeah.
and their own investment. Um, why hasn't this developed a an interest in the public before now? Because
Well,
it seems like it has the benefits of creating the energy that
I,
all
I
these
I
other
would love to
things,
say that I came up with
not the
this idea
detrimental
myself.
effects. It doesn't have the detrimental effects of oil or when solar panels and the wind farms, when their service life is over. My understanding is that there's a tremendous issue of recycling the
Yeah.
materials out of it.
Yeah, and I mean that's an issue that they didn't foresee when they built them. But all of the wind power companies are now saying their next generation of wind turbines will be completely recyclable. Um, so they didn't expect that the fiberglass would flex and break the way that it has. Anyway, going back to what you're saying, absolutely. So the reason that this isn't out there is because it's been in my head and I haven't been talking about it. That's why I wrote the book. But the idea isn't original to me. I have a book that's called Engineer's Dream. It was written by a fellow by the name of Willie Lay. He was an associate of Werner von Braun. And he talks about that OTEC technology that I was mentioning earlier. And then there's just a couple of paragraphs where somebody says, "Oh, by the way, this idea of taking heat, generating power from the oceans would work even better in the Arctic." And I'm thinking, not a lot of people have probably read that book. And those who did were like, "Oh, well, that's an interesting idea, but who's going to develop it?"
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, technology has moved on so far from those days, like back in the 50s, that now it's viable, but it seems like nobody has you know realized that this energy source is out there. It's like for the number of people who are aware of it, I've never heard of anyone else talking about developing it the way that I've written about in my book.
Does it does it therefore really require um, a national government to say we believe in this, so we're going to put some money into developing this?
Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't have to be a national government. Like I said, this is scalable, so we could build a model that would like build a turbine that would produce 1 kilowatt, let's say, which is what the equivalent of a solar panel, just as a proof of concept. But it's entirely scalable to the gigawatt scale as well. And it probably works much more efficiently at that scale because um, you're able to siphon the warmer water up from the ocean bottom and all that sort of stuff, or the mid latitudes of the ocean, I should say.
It seems like the greatest inhibiting factor is simply the infrastructure that delivers that energy to
Right.
large
Um,
populations.
So I talked, I mean, I look at all these aspects in the book. So how do you get that energy if you're out in the middle of, say, Hudson Bay or the Arctic Ocean or Antarctica? How do you get that energy to the end user? So obviously you can produce it on site, and then I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but for these polar energy platforms to work, you know, you'd be in the Arctic in the cold of winter, and then you transition down to Antarctica so that you're getting the cold down there and being able to run this power cycle. And if you are able to, you know, travel at the speed of a US Navy aircraft carrier at 35 kilometers an hour or something like that, you can make that transition within a couple of weeks.
Mhm.
Um,
So it'd be equivalent to seeing what happens, say, in the Middle East, where they're loading ships up with natural gas
Methane. Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and shipping it. I mean, it would be equivalent to that.
It's very similar to that. So ammonia and natural gas have similar challenges to transport. If you're wanting to work with hydrogen, that's an entirely different kettle of fish. But I talk about two technologies that haven't been developed. So if you think of about a submarine, it's essentially a pressure vessel, right? Well, one of the issues we have in the Arctic, of course, is we got the ice that's impeding us. So either you have to bring in icebreakers and you know, bring out the goods that way if you want them developed in the or delivered in the middle of winter. Um, that's fairly expensive. But imagine if you had a system where you have autonomous submarines, and since you already have a pressure vessel to, you know, keep it from imploding, you fill that up with ammonia instead for the most part, and you have to have your engine and other working equipment there, and have some oxygen if you're going to be burning the ammonia as a fuel. But essentially, you could have almost the entire thing filled with ammonia and run that under the ice. And then when you get out to, you know, it could operate on the surface once you get beyond the ice pack. Um, and then have this thing guided by GPS. You don't need people on board it. It gets to, say, New York Harbor or something like that. Then you get a pilot to come in and drive it in the last little bit. So this whole system could be largely automated if marine regulations allow that to be the case. You know, there's probably some rules that say you have to have people on board, but there are lots of examples of things floating around in the ocean that are just piloted by GPS and computer systems. Now, that's one option. The other option that we have, of course, hydrogen, if you're producing that, is a lighter than air gas. And everybody's familiar with the Hindenburg disaster. Well, you could distribute the hydrogen in airships, and that has some advantages in that not only can you deliver the hydrogen to remote areas, so let's say you want to deliver it to the middle of the desert, say Phoenix or someplace like that. You can have if you have a gigawatt plant producing just hydrogen, or essentially just hydrogen, um, you would be able to run a chain of these airships going back and forth. And essentially what you're doing is you're transferring the power from the Arctic to the end location. But here's the other side benefit. If you set up your power plant on top of a mesa or something, uh, once you're burning that hydrogen in a fuel cell, you're producing water.
Yeah.
And so now you got water in the desert, and it's a significant amount of water. It's enough water that you could run a small hydroelectric plant. You know, if you're, you know, half a mile high above the desert floor, you could generate some electricity from that, and then you run that water through. So you can use that for, of course, people, and you can use that water for irrigation in say greenhouses or something like that, and then the people can eat the food, and then you have a local you know, ecosystem that's all being run from energy from the Arctic. And I talk about the size of how many people could you actually support with that, and it's about, you could do about a 1 gigawatt plant would be able to supply enough water for 40,000 people if they're using the
Huh.
water judiciously, like a lot of desert communities are.
So what's the next step for you in this?
Well, I'm out promoting the book. I want to get as many people to read it as possible. I've got at the end of the book, I have a whole bunch of asks. So I'm looking for people who catch on to this vision. So you might be an environmentalist and you say, "Well, I want to get off of fossil fuels." You might be a business person and you say, "I want to get in on that water action." You might be a government and you want to be reaching your carbon commitment goals. There's all sorts of reasons to get involved with this. What I'm looking for is people to step forward if they've got the financing to help me that way. If I've got a website developer that I'm working with, but I'm always looking for um, more ideas on how to promote this. I've also got on my website, infiniteresourcesbook.com. You can purchase the book through Amazon. But you also can access a Discord server that I set up specifically for talking about the issues that are in the book. And yeah, contact me. Let's get this out there. Um, you know, Elon Musk talks about going to Mars for the next phase of human development. And I support him in that. I think that's fantastic. But let's develop the Arctic and the Antarctic regions. That's a lot easier than going to Mars. And there's a lot of resources that are available here on Earth that we can tap into before going there. And you were talking a little bit about can this be done on an individual basis? Yeah. Uh, there's a concept called seasteading, and I could totally see a group of like-minded people. This could be a religious group or maybe conservatives or liberals, who knows, whatever group you want to connect with. But if you have a bunch of like-minded people that want to set up a community, you could live in international waters and do this sort of thing. So
Wow, this is really cool. And sorry for the pun. Um, and I think it represents that there's always a new idea waiting to be discovered and waiting to be shared and waiting to be developed. And it sounds like this is ideal for a time where there's so much conflict over energy. This seems like kind of the answer to everything, though it's not really an answer to everything, but it is an answer which has less of a detrimental effect to it than so many others.
when you look at industrial platforms, people think in like one way of one process, and engineers are especially bad for that. Whereas I'm thinking in a much more synergistic approach to it. So it's like, okay, well, we've got a platform. What can we do that? You could have all of these energy things that I'm talking about and still put a wind turbine on it. I mean, take advantage of what you got there.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I'd like to just mention is if the problem that's facing humanity right now is global warming, doesn't it make sense to take advantage of the natural processes for global cooling?
Mm-hmm.
And so the polar regions are the best regions to cool the world.
Well, Jeff, I appreciate you coming on. This is really fascinating. It's totally new to me. I think my questions displayed that. But it certainly makes sense to me, and I hope it finds some people who wants to invest in this and promote this, because it seems like an answer to a problem that exists rather than an answer seeking to identify a problem that may not exist.
Mhm.
Things are like that, and we'll put whatever you want to put in the show notes so that people can be in touch with you and purchase your book. We'll be able to do that as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to leave maybe with a quote from Peter Diamandis, who's somebody that I follow and
Yeah.
admire a lot. He says, "Imagine a world of 9 billion people with clean water, nutritious food, affordable housing, personalized education, top-tier medical care, and non-polluting ubiquitous energy. Building this better world is humanity's greatest challenge. And then he has another quote,
Uh,
you know, the world's biggest problems are the world's biggest business opportunities. So I think we got some pretty big problems here that I'm trying to tackle, and I think that they are really good business opportunities, and I'm looking for, you know, the people to work with to make them happen.
well, I hope some people find you and begin to talk with you about this. And I'm glad you've been on the podcast. This is very unique, and I totally agree with Peter in his ideas that, you know, all this negativity about fear, all this fear about the future of the, you know, my sense is that's a product of our not willing uh, um, to look for opportunities that can actually do the kinds of things you're talking about. So let's make it happen.
Yeah, yeah, let's do it. I really appreciate you for inviting me onto your podcast, and um, I've listened to a few episodes in preparing for this meeting, and I like what I'm hearing. So
Thank
good
you.
on you for getting that started. So
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, everybody, for watching, for listening, and look forward to seeing you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye-bye.
bye bye.